Imagine this. You wake up one morning and feel something missing. Not like a memory lost or an object misplaced, but as if a part of you quietly vanished overnight. You look in the mirror and see a reflection that feels unfamiliar. It smiles correctly. It frowns correctly. It speaks with your voice. But beneath the practiced expressions, there's a hollow absence where something once stirred: rage, lust, envy, hunger, the primal thrum of life itself. You don't remember when it happened, but somewhere between childhood innocence and adult civility, you decided to amputate your darkness. You buried it under politeness, self-control, and good intentions. You killed the part of yourself that scared you. At first, this seemed like victory. You became composed, rational, healed. You learned to keep your temper, to silence desire, to speak kindly even when resentment burned behind your teeth. Society applauded you. Friends said you'd matured. You became the kind of person people trust, the one who never causes trouble. But now the silence inside you feels wrong. You've traded chaos for numbness. You can no longer tell whether your kindness is genuine or just another disguise. You have mastered peace at the cost of passion. You have become good by becoming dead. This is the tragedy of the man who killed his shadow. He was praised for his restraint, but haunted by his dreams. He wore serenity like a mask, while beneath it the disowned parts of his psyche festered, rejected, hungry, watching from the dark. He mistook repression for virtue and exile for transcendence. He thought he'd slain the monster, but all he did was blind himself to it. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Yet most people spend their lives doing the opposite. They kill their unconscious in hopes of feeling safe. They amputate their anger and call it forgiveness. They suffocate their sexuality and call it discipline. They silence their grief and call it strength. And slowly, the corpse of the shadow begins to rot, leaking into dreams, habits, addictions, and self-sabotage. You can see it everywhere. In the man who preaches morality, but secretly despises himself. In the woman who always smiles but drinks until she can't. In the activist whose compassion turns to hatred. In the monk who hides lust beneath robes of purity. These are not hypocrites. They are people who have tried to kill their shadow, unaware that the shadow is immortal. What happens when you destroy the part of you that knows how to fight, how to desire, how to rage against injustice? What remains when you silence every dark impulse that could have protected your boundaries or fueled your art? You become manageable, predictable, a perfectly civilized ghost. The man who killed his shadow thought he was becoming enlightened. In truth, he was becoming less human, and perhaps that's the secret horror of modern self-improvement. The belief that growth means sterilizing the soul until nothing wild remains. We read mindfulness books not to find awareness, but to tranquilize our thoughts. We practice detachment not as wisdom but as escape. We don't want transformation. We want anesthesia, but the shadow does not die. It waits, it watches, it whispers. And one day when the mask slips, when exhaustion breaks the illusion of control, it returns with a vengeance. That is why the man who kills his shadow never truly rests. He dreams of violence, of forbidden pleasures, of being someone else. He begins to sense that morality itself may be the cage that keeps him from freedom. What if the shadow you fear is not your enemy, but your teacher? What if everything you've repressed, the rage, the jealousy, the lust, the selfishness, is not proof of corruption but evidence of life? Imagine realizing that the darkness you've spent years trying to destroy was never meant to be erased, only understood. That maybe the true self isn't found in perfection, but in the tension between light and dark. The man who killed his shadow believed he'd found peace. What he discovered instead was emptiness, a sterile light without warmth, without depth, without truth. And somewhere deep within, something ancient began to stir again. A whisper, faint but defiant. You cannot kill what you are. The question remains then, what happens when the shadow returns? When the parts you buried start to rise, demanding recognition, will you face them or kill them again? The next section explores the roots of this inner war, the psychological and philosophical forces that taught humanity to fear its own soul. From the beginning, human beings have feared what they cannot control, and nothing terrifies us more than ourselves. Civilization, in many ways, was built as a fortress against the chaos of our own nature. Every law, every moral code, every social expectation is a kind of psychological spell, a way to keep the darkness contained. But like all spells, it comes at a cost. When you were young, you didn't know how to hide. You screamed when angry, cried when hurt, desired without shame. You were raw life, chaotic, yes, but whole. Then came the training, the long, slow domestication of the human soul. Parents scolded, teachers corrected, religion warned. You learned that certain emotions were bad, certain thoughts unacceptable. And so began your apprenticeship in fragmentation. This is how the shadow is born, not from evil, but from rejection. Carl Jung described the shadow as the sum of all those traits and instincts we deny, repress, or hide from others. It is everything we refuse to see in ourselves. The anger we label unspiritual, the selfishness we deny, the sexuality we fear, the jealousy we mask with politeness. Over time, we bury these pieces so deeply that we forget they exist. But they do exist, and they never stop acting upon us. You might think of the psyche as a vast ecosystem. Light and dark are its natural balance, predator and prey. When you exterminate one side, the entire system collapses. Repression doesn't erase instinct. It distorts it. The anger you refuse to feel doesn't vanish. It becomes passive aggression. The desire you suppress doesn't dissolve. It resurfaces as obsession. The fear you deny doesn't fade. It disguises itself as arrogance or control. Nietzsche saw this clearly. In his time, he watched Europe suffocate under moral idealism, where virtue meant denial of instinct. He called it the morality of the weak, a system that glorified meekness and submission because it was terrified of strength. Beware, he wrote, lest in casting out your devil you cast out the best thing in you. To Nietzsche, the path to greatness demanded integration, not purity. You must learn to dance with your demons, not destroy them. But society rewards the opposite. It teaches us to wear masks of virtue. It tells men to suppress tenderness and women to suppress anger. It tells everyone to be positive, as if sadness were a moral flaw. We mistake emotional anesthesia for enlightenment. And so we end up like mirrors polished too clean, reflecting everything, but containing nothing. Arthur Schopenhauer traced this suffering to the very structure of human will. To him, existence was not guided by reason, but by blind striving, a ceaseless, unconscious will to live and to dominate. Consciousness merely witnesses this struggle and invents excuses for it. We repress the will because it reminds us that we are not the masters of ourselves. The illusion of control depends on burying the truth that we are driven by something older, hungrier and less moral than the ego can tolerate. Aldous Huxley, writing centuries later, warned that modernity had perfected this repression through pleasure rather than punishment. In Brave New World, people didn't need tyranny, they had distraction. The shadow no longer needed to be chained. It could be drowned in entertainment, work, and consumer comfort. We learned to sedate the unconscious rather than confront it, and we called it happiness. Gabor Maté, a modern physician and thinker, reveals another side of this pattern. He argues that addiction, whether to substances, approval, or success, is not a disease of pleasure but a response to pain. The pain comes from disconnection, from being cut off from our authentic emotions. Addiction, in this view, is not the pursuit of ecstasy, but the avoidance of shadow. The more disconnected we become from our true feelings, the more compulsively we chase substitutes for them. So the man who killed his shadow doesn't simply lose his darkness. He loses his vitality. Without the shadow, he becomes morally correct, but spiritually starved. He cannot feel deeply, love passionately, or create authentically. He becomes a collection of good behaviors, a mannequin of virtue. Jean-Paul Sartre might say he has fallen into bad faith, the self-deception of pretending to be something other than what you are. To live in bad faith is to act out a role, to reduce yourself to a concept, the good person, the enlightened one, the victim, the professional. Each mask brings order, but every mask also suffocates. The more roles we play, the less soul we have left. Modern psychology often reinforces this trap. Therapies built around optimization and self-control sometimes forget that not all chaos is unhealthy. When we speak of regulating emotions, what we often mean is eliminating discomfort. But discomfort is the signal of the shadow trying to speak. Anxiety, depression, rage, they are not malfunctions but messages. They say, "You have forgotten something essential. The hidden problem, then, is not the existence of the shadow, but the illusion that we can live without it. We have become moral bureaucrats of our own minds, filing every impulse into acceptable and forbidden folders. Yet beneath that tidy system lies the primordial truth. Everything human contains both poison and medicine. Every virtue casts a shadow. Compassion can become control. Confidence can turn into narcissism. Discipline can curdle into rigidity. And when you deny these paradoxes, they return in monstrous form. History proves it. Entire nations have killed their collective shadows, projecting them onto others. Jews, witches, foreigners, heretics. The more a society claims moral purity, the more violently it hunts the reflection of its own sins. The same is true in the individual. The more you insist, "I am not angry," the more your actions will speak otherwise. The more you claim, "I am humble," the more your pride hides behind it. The more you chase purity, the dirtier your unconscious becomes. This is the hidden architecture of the human psyche, a house divided, maintained by denial. And denial, like all architecture, eventually cracks. The man who killed his shadow has built his life upon such denial. But no matter how polished the facade, something beneath it begins to stir. Nightmares return. Passions awaken. A strange restlessness creeps into his calm. For what is buried alive will one day dig itself out, and when it does, the consequences are not gentle. The next section reveals what happens when the buried self begins to rise, how the unseen consequences of shadow suppression ripple through our relationships, our culture, and the very fabric of who we believe we are. The man who killed his shadow did not notice the decay at first. His life looked immaculate from the outside, a quiet triumph of control. He rose early, spoke calmly, performed his duties with discipline. People admired his composure. He appeared balanced, detached, morally upright. But beneath the still surface of his being, something began to rot. It started as small irritations, sudden flashes of anger over trivial things, a tightening in the chest when someone disagreed with him. Then came the dreams, violent, sexual, confusing. In them, he was both the hunter and the prey. He would wake sweating, ashamed, but also strangely alive. It was as if a forgotten voice had begun whispering through the cracks in his carefully built mind. The more he tried to silence it, the louder it became. This is how the shadow returns, first as discomfort, then as compulsion, finally as collapse. When you exile your darkness, you create an internal pressure, a psychological gravity that pulls toward explosion. Neuroscience now confirms what philosophy long intuited. Repressed emotion does not disappear. It lodges in the body, altering the nervous system, warping perception. Chronic suppression of anger, for example, correlates with higher stress hormones, autoimmune disease, even cancer risk. The body becomes the shadow's last refuge, but the consequences reach further than health. They shape identity itself. A person who denies their shadow must build a false self to replace it. A mask stitched together from approval, conformity, and half-truths. Jung called this mask the persona. It allows us to function in society, but when mistaken for the whole self, it becomes a prison. You no longer live as a human being, but as an image of one. Behind every burnout, every midlife crisis, every quiet sense of meaninglessness lies this silent war between persona and shadow. The more perfectly the mask fits, the more suffocating it becomes. In modern culture, the persona is not just individual, it's collective. Social media is its cathedral. Here we curate identities, polish our virtues, display empathy on demand. We don't just repress our shadows, we algorithmically erase them. Every post becomes a performance of light, while the darkness festers unseen behind screens. The result is epidemic anxiety, imposter syndrome, an annoying sense that everyone, including ourselves, is pretending. Carl Jung warned that the brighter the light, the darker the shadow. Our technological brilliance, our moral progress, our obsession with positivity, these have cast longer shadows than any generation before. Depression, addiction, and loneliness surge precisely when our public image appears most enlightened. We are the most self-aware species in history, and yet perhaps the least self-accepting. The man who killed his shadow begins to feel this split in everything he does. His friendships feel shallow. His relationships crumble under the weight of unspoken needs. He finds himself incapable of true intimacy, because intimacy requires exposure, and exposure threatens the image he's worked so hard to maintain. Love cannot exist where the shadow is denied. You cannot love someone fully if you are afraid of your own darkness, because love requires seeing both the beauty and the terror of another person. It demands vulnerability, and vulnerability means the possibility of chaos. The man without a shadow may appear safe, but he can never be known. He hides behind goodness, afraid that if someone saw his full truth they would recoil. But it is not others who would recoil, it is he who cannot bear to look. This avoidance breeds subtle cruelty. A person who represses anger may become passive-aggressive, controlling, or self-righteous. Someone who denies envy may undermine others under the guise of fairness. Someone who fears their own desire may moralize against others' freedom. In each case, the disowned emotion seeks expression through distortion. The shadow will have its voice, even if it must speak in disguise. History is crowded with examples. Religious movements that began with compassion often turned into instruments of persecution. Ideologies built on equality birthed tyrannies. Moral crusades against sin produced corruption behind closed doors. When entire societies repress their shadows, they erupt in collective madness. Every witch hunt, every genocide, every online mob begins with the same sentence. They are the evil ones, not us. The psychological mechanism is projection, the act of seeing in others what we cannot face in ourselves. Jung called it the indispensable tool of the unconscious. When we project, we externalize our shadow, locating our inner darkness in someone else. It provides temporary relief from self-awareness, but at the cost of perpetual conflict. You can see projection in politics, religion, even in personal relationships. The moralist condemns the very impulses he secretly craves. The pacifist despises the warrior within, and thus becomes weak in the face of aggression. The modern good person learns to hate the unapologetic, the primal, the passionate, because they remind him of what he has lost. And so the man who killed his shadow begins to resent those who are alive. He mocks artists for being emotional, dismisses lovers as foolish, views rebels as dangerous. In truth, he envies their wholeness. He envies their willingness to bleed. His soul aches not for more peace, but for more reality. Here lies the cruel paradox. The more he tries to control his darkness, the more it controls him. Repression breeds obsession. He becomes fixated on morality, order, perfection. Every failure feels catastrophic. Every mistake proof of worthlessness. The shadow, once exiled, becomes the inner critic, the relentless voice whispering that he is never enough. The modern mind suffers from this same wound. We have mistaken self-control for self-knowledge. We believe discipline can replace depth. But what we call self-improvement often amounts to spiritual taxidermy, preserving the shape of life while removing the wildness that made it living, and so the consequences accumulate. Numbness, addiction, spiritual exhaustion. We scroll, consume, achieve, all to escape the quiet terror of our own unlived selves. But eventually repression fails. The pressure builds until it finds release. Through breakdown, through art, through crisis, the shadow returns not as a polite guest, but as a force of destruction and renewal. Jung called this confrontation individuation, the process of becoming whole by integrating what was once feared. But few ever make it that far. Most fight until the end, mistaking their own rebirth for death. The man who killed his shadow is nearing this precipice. His life, though orderly, begins to feel like a performance he can no longer sustain. Every smile feels heavy. Every achievement feels hollow. He senses the presence of something watching him from within, waiting to be acknowledged. He is about to learn the truth that all seekers must face. The darkness does not destroy you, it completes you. But before that realization comes the rebellion. In the next section, we enter the turning point, the moment he stops running and begins to rebel against the false light that imprisoned him. One night, the man who killed his shadow dreams of a door. Behind it, he hears something breathing, a low rhythmic sound neither threatening nor gentle. When he reaches for the handle, fear grips him, and he wakes with his heart pounding. For the first time, he does not push the fear away. He sits in it, trembling but curious. Something within him whispers, "You've been running from yourself long enough." That moment marks the rebellion, not against society, not against morality, but against self-deception. True rebellion begins when a person stops fleeing the mirror. It starts quietly, like a crack in a dam, a confession, a breakdown, a strange urge to tell the truth. The man begins to admit things he never allowed himself to say. I am jealous. I am angry. I want, I fear, I hate, I love. With each word, something ancient exhales. The breath behind the door grows louder, warmer, almost human. This is not a descent into darkness. It is the return to wholeness. Carl Jung called this confrontation shadow integration, a process not of cleansing the soul, but of completing it. It is an act of spiritual alchemy, where base emotions become fuel for transformation. Anger becomes strength. Desire becomes vitality. Fear becomes awareness. The rebel does not kill his demons. He teaches them to serve a greater purpose. This rebellion demands brutal honesty. You must be willing to see yourself without anesthesia, to look at your envy and ask what it longs for, to face your rage and ask what boundary it is defending, to meet your fear and ask what love it is trying to protect. Every emotion, no matter how ugly, conceals an unmet need or an unlived truth. The goal is not to justify the darkness, but to translate it. Friedrich Nietzsche called this the transvaluation of values, the courage to re-examine what we have been taught to call good and evil. He argued that morality, when imposed without introspection, becomes a cage for the human spirit. The strong do not reject morality, but they redefine it from within. They refuse to be domesticated by the herd's definition of virtue. They embrace their instincts not as chaos, but as the raw materials of creation. To integrate the shadow is to reclaim responsibility for your power. It means acknowledging that you are capable of cruelty, manipulation, and ego, but choosing awareness over denial. Only then can morality have meaning, because it arises from freedom, not fear. The rebellion continues when you stop performing goodness and start living truth. It's when you say no without guilt, express anger without shame, and desire without apology. It's when you allow yourself to be contradictory, a being of both light and fire. The integrated self does not seek to be pure. It seeks to be real. Think of every great artist, philosopher, or spiritual figure who ever changed the world. None of them were pure. Dostoyevsky, haunted by gambling and despair, wrote of redemption with unparalleled tenderness. Van Gogh, tormented by madness, painted eternity into color. Jung himself wrestled with visions that would have shattered lesser minds. They did not escape their shadows, they conversed with them. And from that dialogue came wisdom. History's true revolutionaries are those who dared to face their own abyss and return with light. The man who killed his shadow begins to understand this. He stops hiding behind politeness and begins to feel again. The first sensations are overwhelming. Grief floods in, followed by anger, then laughter. He realizes that emotions are not enemies but messengers. Each carries a truth about his neglected self. He revisits the moments he once buried, the times he lied to avoid conflict, the desires he repressed to appear moral, the ambitions he abandoned for acceptance. One by one he pulls them from the ground like old roots. Some are poisonous, but some contain medicine. He learns that rebellion is not destruction, it is restoration. Yet this path is not safe. Society does not welcome those who reclaim their darkness. People fear what cannot be easily categorized. The integrated person makes others uncomfortable because they are whole, unpredictable, unashamed. They mirror back what others refuse to see. That is why many who awaken retreat again into conformity. The pull of normalcy is strong, the comfort of masks intoxicating. But the rebel persists. He knows that integration is not a one-time revelation, but a lifelong discipline. To live with the shadow is to live in dialogue with it, to listen without submission, to act without repression. It requires vigilance, humility, humor. Viktor Frankl once wrote that between stimulus and response lies a space, and in that space lies our freedom. Shadow work expands that space. It turns reaction into reflection, compulsion into choice. You still feel the old impulses, jealousy, anger, fear, but they no longer drive you blindly. You can hold them in consciousness, like wild animals that no longer need to bite to be heard. The man who once lived in numb peace now finds a deeper serenity, one born not of control, but of acceptance. His mind no longer trembles at contradiction. He can love without needing to possess. He can fail without collapsing into shame. He can stand in darkness and know it as part of light. This is the paradox of liberation. When you stop trying to be good, you become whole. Rebellion against repression is not chaos, it is coherence. It is the act of returning to your natural complexity, of recognizing that the divine and the demonic share the same source. For perhaps, as Jung hinted, God himself has a shadow. And to deny our own is to deny the reflection of the sacred within us. The man who killed his shadow has begun to live again. But the journey is not yet complete. Integration is not the end. It is the doorway to the deepest truth of all. That what you call darkness is not the opposite of light, but its foundation. The next section unveils that final realization, the moment when the boundary between light and shadow dissolves entirely, revealing the ultimate truth about what it means to be human. There comes a moment when rebellion becomes stillness. The man who killed his shadow stands no longer in battle with himself. The war is over, not because one side has won, but because both have surrendered. For the first time he can look at his reflection and see not fragments but a whole. His eyes do not burn with shame or pride. They simply witness. He realizes the truth that had been waiting all along. The shadow was never his enemy. It was his reflection in unlit water, the proof that he had depth. Every emotion he had feared was part of the same current. The anger that once frightened him was his instinct to defend meaning. The jealousy he despised was his yearning to grow. The lust he condemned was his hunger for union with life itself. Even the hatred he suppressed was an inverted form of love, wounded by betrayal and unmet truth. Nothing within him was evil, only misunderstood. This is the revelation that dissolves duality. Light does not defeat darkness. It defines it. Darkness does not destroy light. It gives it shape. One cannot exist without the other, just as sound cannot exist without silence. The shadow is the necessary opposite of consciousness, the womb from which awareness is born. Carl Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The man finally understands. Enlightenment is not ascension, it is descent. It is the willingness to walk into one's own night with open eyes, to find the divine not above, but within the soil of imperfection. The greatest illusion of humanity is that purity leads to transcendence. But transcendence is not purity, it is integration. The saints who denied their bodies, the thinkers who rejected emotion, the moralists who condemned desire, all tried to climb toward heaven by cutting off their roots. Yet heaven is not reached by rising above the earth, but by embracing it fully. Nietzsche's Übermensch, often misunderstood as the figure of domination, is in truth the image of integration, the one who has reconciled his contradictions, who has learned to say yes to life in all its terror and beauty, to say yes even to suffering, yes even to failure, yes even to the parts of himself that once seemed monstrous. That yes is the voice of wholeness. The man who killed his shadow no longer seeks perfection. He seeks truth. He accepts that he will sometimes fail, sometimes deceive himself, sometimes fall back into old patterns. But these are not sins, they are reminders. Every fall is an invitation to return to awareness. Every shadow that reappears is a chance to meet a deeper layer of himself. He begins to see that meaning is not found in escaping contradiction, but in living it gracefully. Life is not a straight path toward light. It is a spiral, descending into darkness to find what the surface could never reveal. Every descent refines the soul. Every conflict clarifies intention. Every sorrow teaches love in a new tongue. Gabor Maté once observed that healing does not mean the absence of pain, but the presence of self. The man now understands that to be healed is not to be unbroken, but to be fully present in one's own fracture, to inhabit it with awareness rather than denial. The shadow is not the wound. It is the voice of the wound asking to be heard. He walks outside and notices for the first time the beauty of imperfection. The tree gnarled by lightning, the cracked pavement filled with rainwater, the scar on his own hand, all speak the same truth. Everything that has been touched by darkness has also been touched by life. The universe itself was born from chaos, not order. The stars emerged from collapse. Creation and destruction are not opposites, but phases of the same eternal rhythm. And so he smiles, not the polite smile he used to wear, but one that rises unbidden, wild and soft. He feels grief and joy entwined, as if two hands, light and dark, had finally met in his chest. He realizes that every act of cruelty he has ever condemned began as someone's attempt to deny their own shadow. Every ideology, every fanaticism, every moral panic is born from this refusal. When people cannot face their inner darkness, they project it outward, creating enemies to destroy what they fear inside themselves. If each person learned to meet their shadow with awareness, the world would no longer need scapegoats. Wars would end not through politics, but through understanding. This is not romantic idealism. It is psychological law. Peace begins within the psyche, or it does not begin at all. He remembers how terrified he once was of losing control, of being swallowed by the dark. But control was never safety. It was suffocation. The shadow was not the abyss. It was the bridge. What he feared as death was birth in disguise. Now when darkness returns, and it always does, he no longer resists. He welcomes it like an old companion. He listens to what it has to say. Sometimes it whispers painful truths. Sometimes it reminds him of forgotten dreams. Sometimes it asks nothing at all but presence. And in those moments, he realizes that the shadow no longer needs to be killed, because it was never separate. He is not light, and he is not dark. He is the meeting point, the eternal twilight where both exist. That is the ultimate truth. The shadow is not to be conquered or purified, but integrated. To live without it is to live half a life. To embrace it is to step into the full, terrifying, magnificent complexity of being human. The man who killed his shadow has become the man who embraced it. He walks differently now, not upright in pride, but grounded in awareness. His peace is not fragile. It breathes. His goodness is not moral. It is alive. He no longer seeks to be blameless. He seeks to be whole. And perhaps that is what the soul has wanted all along. Not perfection, not salvation, but reconciliation. To look into the mirror and finally whisper, with no fear left in the heart, I am both the light and the dark. I am not broken. I am complete. Then the mirror ceases to reflect and begins to shine. To those who have wandered with me through this darkness, thank you. Every word in this reflection belongs as much to you as to the man who killed his shadow. Because every listener, every reader, carries some version of that man within. Thank you to the thinkers whose courage to face the abyss lit this path. Carl Jung, Friedrich Nietzsche, Arthur Schopenhauer, Jean-Paul Sartre, Fyodor Dostoyevsky, Aldous Huxley and Gabor Maté. Their ideas remind us that truth is not found in comfort, but in confrontation. Thank you to every soul who has dared to look inward instead of away. Your willingness to meet your own shadow is the quiet revolution this world needs. And to the darkness itself, thank you for not letting us rest in illusion. Without it, there would be no depth, no compassion, no light worth finding. May this reflection serve as a mirror, and may the one who gazes into it find not perfection, but wholeness.